I chose a half measure when I should have gone all the way.
Well, guys, it finally happened. Uro taken out of the picture, banned officially from Standard, and Standard only. What does this mean for the current Standard metagame? Let's talk about it. So Wizards of the Coast finally made the announcement. The long anticipated ban here is going to be Uro and only Uro. I imagine this may bring some shock and surprise to you, or maybe not, depending on your knowledge of the history of Wizards of the Coast with this kind of thing. But as many folks know, 4-color Omnath is basically running the entire world, and it is a major problem. And of course, 4-color Omnath is Omnath, right? That's got the name. It's called Omnath. Omnath, the new card, is obviously a major problem in the format. The deck that it runs with, here, I'll even show you. We have so many versions of the Omnath deck pre-made up already because they're all just so darn good. They all included Uro, as you can see now based on this. But the Omnath decks don't really need Uro to be functional, right? Like the entire pop-off for these decks is Omnath in conjunction with Lotus Cobra launching things like Escape to the Wilds. All of that can still happen without Uro in the deck. Uro is basically like a very fancy cantrip, if you will. You get a card, you get some life, you get to play another land, all your landfall triggers. Like, it's a nice card for the deck, but it wasn't the card for the deck, which becomes the major problem, right? This deck is still going to exist. We still have all the ramp potential that we had before. Omnath is still going to be able to pop down, do his thing. So the only way you're really going to be able to combat this deck is going to be, continue to be, keep Omnath, keep Lotus Cobra off the board. You need to build a hate deck that is going to try and keep these off the board. Uro not being there just removes one of their win conditions and one of their nicer cards, but it doesn't remove the explosiveness of this deck. I've played this deck much of times myself. I've won many a game where Uro was not a factor, was hardly played. Didn't matter, right? You can pop off with all your spells, doesn't matter. Genesis Ultimatum will chuck everything onto the board, you get a billion triggers, you can escape to the wilds 1,000 times. It's great. There's many versions of this deck. Some have Terror of the Peaks, so that way you can start like shotgunning people. Totally works without Uro. So this is the problem, and I think why the community is probably not overly excited about this, right? If you watched CGB's stream or Croaky's stream this morning where they were talking about it, nobody was excited. This ban feels like it's a little too late for Uro. Uro could have been banned a while ago, but now it's like with the amount of landfall excitement, the amount of ramp potential, we really don't have a great way to stop a land from hitting the field, right? Confounding Conundrum is not the answer for this strategy. They can still play all the lands, they just have to take them back, so they can still explode. So the problem wasn't Uro. Uro helped, but he wasn't the engine for this entire deck. He wasn't the enabler, he was just another sweet card you could have. However, I do believe that there's going to be a very clear response now to the Omnath deck, and that is going to exist in the form of Roguey Boys. Rogues are now going to become extremely good in the meta because the problem that Rogues had against this deck in the past was purely... Here, let me shift myself so you can see the deck fully. The problem with this deck in the past was always the fact that Uro existing means all that mill means you are forcing Uro to show up quicker, right? You can just create a bunch of mill, all of a sudden Uro jumps out, now you've got a major problem, you have to deal with Uro. All of your creatures aren't really meant to deal with something like an Uro. You could have a Nighthawk Scavenger, potentially. We've got some in the sideboard for this deck specifically. But you could have your Nighthawk Scavenger try and fight it. You could have your Death Touching Thieves Guild Enforcer try and fight it. All of those are fun things. But what you couldn't do is get it gone forever. Eventually, I started putting in cards like Cling to Dust. I would have these in the sideboard so that way I could exile them after the fact. But it still becomes a very cumbersome problem with Rogues. But it's gone now. So Rogues are now going to become the major response to 4-color Omnath. You can set it in stone. You can, quote me on this. You can @ me on Twitter, whatever you want to do. Rogues are now going to be the default answer to the world of Magic right now in Standard. 4-color Omnath isn't going anywhere. It's still going to shine. It's still probably going to be the most played deck. However, Rogues now have a very, very solid foot in the meta because Uro is gone, since that was the only card really keeping this deck in check. So I think it's going to be interesting to see which deck outshines the other. I do think it's a pretty even split, now that Oro's gone. Before I would give it slight favoritism towards the 4-color Omnath. Now I think Rogues has a much better chance. The problem though, I think what this does to the meta at large is that you need to be running decks with a ton of creature hate for 2 reasons. And these 2 decks are the reasons, right? So you can't let these cards resolve. You can't let their Soaring Thought Thief hit the board and start milling you. You can't let this Thieves Guild Enforcer stay out there that long because it's going to cause a problem. Surely if the opponent's running like a Nighthawk Scavenger, there's not so many turns you can let that live. So the problem that we've got is that this deck in the Rogues deck and the other deck in the Omnath deck both require a bunch of creature hate. So creature strategies are kind of not so great by default. So this kind of gives problems to decks like Mono Green. This gives decks like the Counters deck, the Abzan Counters deck, to Knights decks, to Mono Red. All of these decks are trying to use creatures to like crank in there. And it's going to be a real problem for pretty much any other deck. So I fully anticipate that things like Sultai Control with their Shark Typhoons as a win condition, I think will be incredibly good. Things like Knights, any kind of fancy stuff with equipment and Boros or anything like that are going to really struggle to even compete with decks like the Rogues deck or the 4-color Omnath deck. It's just going to be a really uphill battle. So what did this ban actually do? I think this ban got rid of, you know, one piece of the puzzle, but it didn't really solve anything. It just opened up the viability for one other deck, as far as I can tell. So not the best. But that's, I think, going to be all for this video. You can check out that other Rogues video. I'll link it in the description below if you want to grab that deck list. But that's going to be it for this video. Feel free to figure out what you can do. Tell me in the comments if you think Oro's got a chance of really changing the meta now that it's banned, or if you think literally nothing's going to change. Tell me how you agree or disagree with what we talked about here. But I love you guys as always. I'll catch you in a future video. Love you guys.